December 1944. A pale fog rolls over a frozen forest somewhere on the Western Front. The trees stand silent, coated in ice, their branches like glass. Beneath them, a cluster of German officers crouch over a map spread on a metal ammunition crate. Their breath turns to mist in the freezing air. Far off, a low rumble echoes through the valleys. It comes slowly at first, a deep, steady vibration that seems to move beneath the earth itself. The captains glance up. One mutters, "Panzerverband, they're finally here." Relief flickers across their faces. For days, they've held a crumbling line, waiting for reinforcements that never came. The sound grows louder, rolling, continuous, alive. It shakes helmets, trembles through the frozen soil. But then there's another sound, a whistle, faint and sharp. A heartbeat later, the horizon erupts. Flashes tear open the fog. The earth leaps upward. Men dive for cover as shrapnel rains down. The thunder wasn't tanks. It was American artillery. A storm that would erase their position before sunrise. In that moment of confusion and shock, one truth became clear. On the Western Front, sound could lie, and thunder could kill. By the closing months of 1944, the Western Front had turned into a vast expanse of exhaustion. The German army, once the sharpest instrument of modern war, was now a patchwork of battered divisions, scattered, under strength, and surviving more on habit than hope. After the collapse in Normandy and the bloody encirclement at Falaise, the Wehrmacht's Western forces had retreated through France in a state of chaos. Columns of men trudged eastward through burning villages and mud-choked roads, pursued relentlessly by Allied fighter-bombers. The once invincible panzer divisions were now reduced to a handful of tanks, guarded by boys and veterans. By autumn, the line had stabilized, if stabilized could even be the word, along Germany's western frontier. There lay the Siegfried Line, a series of old bunkers, dragon's teeth, and anti-tank ditches resurrected in desperation. Behind it, Hitler's high command planned one last gamble, a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes, designed to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace. The soldiers holding the forward positions didn't know this plan in detail. What they knew was simpler. The front was quiet, the weather freezing, and supplies thin. They were told to hold, to resist, delay, and buy time for the reinforcements that were always on their way. For many German captains, those words had lost meaning. In the forests of Hürtgen, Eifel, and Luxembourg, fog and snow blanketed everything. Radios crackled weakly, ammunition ran low, and rations were stretched into silence. The men built fires with torn fence posts and prayed the next shell wouldn't find them. The enemy, too, seemed strangely subdued. American patrols moved cautiously, bogged down by weather and terrain. The front felt suspended, a cold, waiting stillness that lasted days. But beneath that quiet, something vast was shifting. Since the Normandy breakout, American artillery had become the most lethal weapon on the Western Front. Organized, coordinated, and supplied with a precision no army in history had matched. It could rain destruction across miles of front within minutes. Where the Wehrmacht once ruled through movement and surprise, the Allies now ruled through overwhelming firepower. Entire batteries of 105 mm and 155 mm howitzers stood hidden behind ridgelines and woods, connected by telephone and radio to forward observers who watched the battlefield through binoculars and rangefinders. Once a target was spotted, the order passed instantly through the network. Dozens of guns would fire in unison, shells screaming overhead, timed to land within seconds of each other. The Germans had a word for it: Feuerüberfall. Fire raid. But the Americans had perfected it to an art. By late 1944, The U.S. Army's artillery coordination system could shift from one target to another faster than any army in the world. They no longer needed to see their enemies to kill them. They could triangulate, calculate, and obliterate positions shrouded in fog. And that fog, the same dense, low-hanging mist that wrapped around the German positions, made all the difference. It hid the muzzle flashes, muffled the origin of sound, and distorted distance. To a weary German officer standing in the cold, the deep, rolling thunder of artillery could easily sound like tank engines or approaching columns. For men on the edge of exhaustion, hope was louder than logic. In December 1944, along a quiet sector of the line near Kahl Trail and Schmidt, small German command groups waited, convinced that reinforcements from the rear were coming to relieve them. Reports from nearby units were contradictory, messages fragmented, yet through the fog they heard the low, rhythmic rumble, the sound of engines. They thought, and braced themselves for friendly armor to emerge from the mist. But what was moving toward them wasn't steel rolling forward. It was steel falling from above. A sound mistaken for salvation would soon become a storm of annihilation, and as the rumble grew louder, the ground itself began to tremble. The German command structure in the West during late 1944 was collapsing under its own contradictions. Orders came down from Berlin wrapped in illusion, demands for counterattacks by divisions that barely existed, and reports of reinforcements that were little more than names on paper. Field commanders were trapped between two realities, the fantasy in their orders and the mud beneath their boots. Along the Eifel and Ardennes fronts, the 272nd and 275th Volksgrenadier Divisions held what remained of the defensive line. These units, hastily formed from remnants of shattered regiments and convalescent troops, lacked the cohesion and discipline of the old Wehrmacht. Many soldiers had fought in Russia, Italy, or France, only to be thrown back into the line with no heavy weapons, few radios, and barely any transport. Winter deepened their misery. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Vehicles failed to start. Supply trucks froze on forest roads, abandoned like silent metal carcasses. Food was rationed to a crust of bread and black coffee per day. Yet morale, fragile but still present, depended on one idea. Help was coming. Rumors spread faster than truth. Some said a panzer battalion was moving up from Aachen. Others swore that new miracle weapons would soon turn the tide. In the dark, rumor became faith, and faith became survival. That's why, on nights when thunder rolled through the valleys, many officers didn't question what they heard. The deep, continuous rumble, low and distant, like a convoy over frozen ground, seemed to confirm everything they had been promised. But in truth, the Americans had been preparing a different kind of arrival. From the banks of the Aur and Ruhr rivers, U.S. Army artillery groups had been methodically zeroing in on German defensive grids for weeks. Their forward observers, often perched on church towers or hidden in woods, mapped enemy trenches, roads, and suspected headquarters with mathematical precision. Once coordinates were logged, they could unleash a storm of shells in seconds. The American system worked like a machine. Artillery battalions were linked through a network of fire direction centers, where trained officers converted raw map data into firing solutions. Each battery could be redirected within moments, allowing them to hit multiple targets before the Germans could even respond. By contrast, German artillery had been crippled by shortages. Fuel rationing limited mobility. Ammunition deliveries lagged days behind need. The once feared 88mm guns were scattered piecemeal, often used in anti-tank roles where they couldn't affect the wider battle. When fog settled over the forest, the imbalance became fatal. The Americans could fire through the mist, guided by radio and calculation. The Germans, blind and deaf, could only listen, interpreting echoes and vibrations, never knowing what was real. For the officers on the ground, every sound became a question. Was that thunder from the sky, or tanks from the rear? Was that vibration in the earth an engine, or the first shell landing nearby? This confusion wasn't just atmospheric. It was psychological, a symptom of an army unraveling. Reports from captured prisoners later revealed how many frontline units had lost any sense of coordination. Platoons fought in isolation, with no communication to the rear. Entire companies were wiped out without their commanders ever learning where or how. The fog, the noise, and the lies from above had fused into one deadly illusion. By December 15th, the German High Command was finalizing preparations for the Ardennes offensive, Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, but the small unit officers defending sectors north and south of that thrust were left exposed, unaware of the broader plan. They were told simply to hold, even as the Allies concentrated overwhelming artillery along every approach road. And so, when the first rumbling began, that slow, crawling thunder rolling through the mist, German captains leaned on the only hope they had left. They believed it was movement from their own side, engines of salvation coming to break the silence. But artillery does not bring rescue. It announces judgment. The fog thickened. The earth began to pulse. The reinforcements were not coming forward. They were falling from the sky. Soon, the illusion would end in fire. For the German officers holding the line, the battlefield had shrunk to a few hundred meters of mud and fear. They lived in trenches that filled with ice, their boots stiff from frost, their hands raw from days without gloves. The war had stripped away everything familiar. Uniforms faded to rags, faces hollowed by hunger. They were men who had once believed in victory. Now they believed in endurance. Every sound mattered. The whistle of a distant shell could make a platoon drop to the ground in perfect unison. Instinct born of survival. The rattle of tracked vehicles, somewhere in the fog, could send hearts racing. To soldiers starved of sleep and hope, even silence had weight. Eyewitness accounts from the Hürtgen and Eifel fronts describe the same strange rhythm of waiting. Hours of stillness broken by moments of chaos. One veteran later recalled, "You didn't know if the next sound meant life or death. Sometimes we prayed for the noise to stop. Other times we prayed for it to come closer, because that meant ours were coming." When the rumble began that night, it felt like mercy. The fog thickened, and the vibrations underfoot seemed unmistakable. Heavy vehicles, a column advancing. Someone smiled for the first time in days. They believed relief had arrived. That small spark of hope, born from sound, would last only minutes. Moments later, that same sound turned into a roar from above. The men learned, in one terrible instant, how fragile the line was between hope and destruction. Tactically, the battlefield was a labyrinth of error. The terrain in this region, dense forest, narrow roads, deep ravines, made navigation almost impossible, especially in winter fog. German positions were often separated by pockets of woodland that cut off line of sight. Commanders could not see their flanks, and communication lines ran by cable, easily severed by shellfire or frost. When American observers marked coordinates, they often aimed not at visible trenches, but at sound points, echoes from gunfire, flashes in the night, or even thermal distortions. U.S. artillery could then walk fire across a map, shifting by 50 or 100 meters at a time, guided purely by calculation. For German defenders, this was a nightmare. They were fighting a ghost, an enemy who could kill without being seen. The deception of sound played a crucial role. Under heavy overcast skies, the low-frequency rumble of American artillery fire was refracted by the atmosphere, bending back toward the ground and creating the illusion of nearby engines. To the human ear, it felt closer than it was. This acoustic illusion had been studied even during the First World War, But in 1944, amid freezing fog and fatigue, no one had the luxury to analyze it. They heard tanks. They believed what they needed to believe, and tactically, that single assumption sealed their fate. Instead of ordering dispersal or counter-battery movement, some German officers held their men in fixed positions, waiting for the reinforcing armor to arrive. When the first salvo hit, they were still standing by their radios and range tables, thinking the tremor was friendly movement. The Americans, meanwhile, had been zeroing their guns for hours. To the Americans across the line, this wasn't chaos. It was precision. By the winter of 1944, U.S. artillery had reached a level of coordination unmatched in military history. Entire fire missions could be plotted by slide rule and transmitted within seconds. The 125mm M1 howitzer and the 105mm M2A1 were the workhorses of the battlefield, supported by long-range 8-inch guns that could devastate positions 10 miles away. American doctrine had evolved since Normandy. Rather than direct fire at observed targets, they relied on predicted fire, mathematical shooting at pre-mapped coordinates. Even without visibility, their shells found the enemy. This efficiency came from logistics, something the Germans could no longer match. Each American division had dedicated ammunition columns, motorized to ensure a constant supply of shells. A single division could fire thousands of rounds per day, sustained by an industrial machine stretching from Antwerp to Pennsylvania. To the men in the gun batteries, it was both routine and terrifying. They never saw the faces of those they killed, only the recoil of the gun, the smoke, and the thunder that followed. Reports from the 2nd and 28th Infantry Divisions described nights where entire forests glowed red from the muzzle flashes of artillery. Observers noted that after prolonged barrages, the fog would rise into strange, glowing clouds, illuminated by fire and phosphorus. For the Americans, this was not just destruction, it was dominance. Each barrage erased resistance before the infantry moved in. Each explosion broke another link in the German chain of command. Each mistaken rumble in the distance meant one more pocket of defenders blinded, waiting for help that would never arrive. The artillery was not simply a weapon. It was a language, one that spoke of inevitability. And on that night, in that frozen valley, it spoke louder than any engine ever could. The thunder was still rolling, but now it had purpose, and soon its psychological echo would become as lethal as the shells themselves. War distorts the senses long before it breaks the body. By December 1944, the German soldiers along the Siegfried Line were living in a world of half-truths, where sight, sound, and memory all betrayed them. Psychologists who later studied frontline behavior during this period noted a recurring phenomenon: acoustic illusion under stress. Under conditions of fatigue, cold, and fear, the human brain struggles to interpret low-frequency sound. When men are half-starved and deprived of sleep, the mind fills in what it expects to hear. In the fog-bound forests of the Western Front, that meant tanks, the slow, continuous rumble of distant artillery, rolling through valleys and bouncing off wooded slopes, became an auditory mirage. Men swore they could hear treads and engines, even when none existed. It was not ignorance. It was biology. This illusion had lethal consequences. When the rumble began, some units actually exposed themselves, stepping out from cover to signal or look for their incoming reinforcements. Seconds later, the first shells arrived. Survivors later recalled the horror of realizing what they had heard was not help, but death. "It was like the ground betrayed us," one German veteran said decades later. "We believed in the noise, and the noise lied." In that moment, sound became the enemy. This psychological dimension explains not only a tactical failure, but a human tragedy. Men so conditioned by loss that even Destruction sounded like deliverance if the frontline soldiers were victims of illusion. Their commanders were prisoners of delusion. By the winter of 1944, the German officer corps on the Western Front faced an impossible paradox. They were expected to hold ground indefinitely without the means to do so. Orders from higher command were increasingly detached from reality. Hitler's insistence on no retreat left officers with no tactical flexibility. Captains and lieutenants on the ground knew their positions were untenable. They reported shortages of ammunition, broken communications, and enemy artillery superiority. But each message sent upward was filtered through layers of command that refused to accept failure. Instead, the replies came back the same. Reinforcements are en route. And so, when the fog rolled in and thunder rumbled in the distance, it fit the official narrative. It was easier and safer to believe that help was coming than to admit that the sound was the prelude to another bombardment. Leadership paralysis turned confusion into catastrophe. When the first American shells landed, some German units received no counter-orders for nearly an hour. Field telephones were destroyed, radio batteries dead. Small unit leaders improvised defenses, but without artillery support, they could only dig deeper and pray. Reports from Allied intercepts later confirmed the scale of the disarray. Fragmented transmissions in panicked tones, half-finished sentences, coordinates lost mid-speech, filled the airwaves. The fog had not only blinded them, it had isolated them. By the time higher command realized that the thunder was American fire, it was too late. The line had already been broken, command posts destroyed, communication lines severed. The captains who had waited for help were now alone, surrounded by ruin. In that sense, leadership failed not at the front, but far above it, in an echo chamber of denial that stretched all the way to Berlin. At its core, this tragedy was a story of technology. Of one side, mastering the machinery of modern war while the other fell. Behind, the United States Army's artillery network, by late 1944, represented the peak of industrialized coordination. Using proximity fuses, radar adjustments, and centralized fire direction centers, American forces could engage targets hidden by terrain or weather. A single forward observer, armed with a map and radio, could summon an entire battalion's worth of fire within minutes. The Germans, by contrast, were fighting with systems designed for a different war. One built on maneuver, speed, and initiative. Artillery in the Blitzkrieg years had moved with the tanks. By 1944, it was stationary, starving for shells, and lacking fuel to reposition. This technological divide created an entirely new kind of battlefield psychology. The Americans didn't need to see their enemy. The Germans, however, still relied on visual cues, sight, sound, and instinct. When those cues were distorted by fog and fatigue, they were effectively blind, and behind every American shell was a continent's worth of production. The same factories that built cars in Detroit now built guns. The same railways that once carried passengers now carried powder, steel, and death. It wasn't just artillery. It was industrial warfare in its purest form. Mathematics, logistics, and physics converging into annihilation. By the end of 1944, the Germans had no countermeasure for this level of fire coordination. Their radar systems were sparse, counter-battery capability minimal. They fought against a machine that could strike from miles away and vanish into silence before a response could even be planned. That night, the night when captains mistook thunder for tanks, symbolized the end of an era. The romantic idea of the decisive tank thrust, of heroic maneuver and field command, had died. The new language of war was impersonal. Coordinates, calculations, and shells. The battlefield had become a board of numbers. And for those trapped within it, sound itself was a lie. The fog would soon lift, but only to reveal devastation, and the moment when the thunder found its mark. The first shells arrived without warning. A deep concussion rolled through the ground, not ahead of the German lines, but beneath them. The men looked up instinctively, but the sky was invisible, smothered by fog. Then the second wave hit. The forest erupted. A command post vanished in a flash of light and soil. The blast hurled men, trees, and frozen earth skyward in one single motion. No one saw the shells coming. They were fired from 10 kilometers away, timed by synchronized watches, plotted on maps the Americans had drawn weeks earlier. Inside the forward trenches, sound turned to chaos. The low, rolling thunder that had once seemed distant now became unbearable. Layered, multiplied, endless. The ground itself convulsed, as if something beneath it was alive and tearing to the surface. German radio operators shouted into dead handsets. The lines had been cut in the first minute. The few working field phones sputtered static. No voice, no orders. The officers tried to shout commands, but their words drowned in the bombardment. It wasn't a barrage in the old sense. Not the creeping artillery of the Great War, slow and patterned. This was something else, a mathematical storm. American fire direction centers had ordered a time-on-target strike, a new technique perfected that autumn. It meant every battery, from 105mm to 150mm guns, calculated its firing time so that all shells would land simultaneously across a grid of coordinates. No warning, no build-up, just instant devastation. In less than 60 seconds, over 1,000 shells rained down across a 2-kilometer sector. The effect was beyond comprehension. The first explosions ruptured eardrums, the next buried survivors. Every blast tore up frozen soil, turning splinters of wood and ice into lethal fragments. Tree trunks were split open. Bunkers collapsed under concussive shock waves. The men who had mistaken the thunder for tanks now lay scattered, some clutching their helmets, others still staring upward in disbelief. The fog illuminated briefly, each explosion flashing white behind the smoke, like lightning trapped inside a cloud. To anyone watching from afar, it looked like the earth itself was flashing in pain. Minutes passed, though time meant nothing now. Every second carried the weight of impact, the rhythm of destruction pounding faster than the human heart could bear. Somewhere along the line, a captain tried to regroup what was left of his company. He ordered men to fall back toward a nearby farmhouse, only to find it already burning. The artillery had anticipated every fallback route. That was the genius and terror of American fire coordination. They didn't just target trenches, they mapped escape patterns. Each likely movement route, each forest trail, each visible road, all had been pre-sighted. When the survivors ran, the fire followed them. For the American gunners miles away, it was a silent, mechanical process. Coordinates in, elevation adjusted, fuse set, fire. They couldn't see the effect, only the recoil of the gun and the echoes rolling back across the valleys. But they knew the rhythm. Every detonation meant another coordinate erased. The German artillery response was minimal. A few isolated batteries tried to return fire, but their guns were old, their ammunition limited, their spotting impossible in the fog. Within minutes, counter-battery radar picked up their muzzle flashes and silenced them. The balance of sound was absolute. The Americans spoke. The Germans fell silent. As the barrage continued, the snow began to fall again, fine and slow, drifting into the smoke. The fog mixed with powder and dust until the forest disappeared entirely. For the men trapped inside, the world had become nothing but vibration and flame. Reports from the aftermath described trees twisted into shapes beyond recognition. Entire platoons buried alive, rifles bent from blast pressure. One survivor later said, "It was like the mountain was breathing fire." When the shelling finally paused, only for minutes, there was no cheer, no movement, only the hiss of steam rising from craters where snow had melted. The captains who had waited for help now crawled among wreckage, half deaf, half buried. Their compasses were useless, their maps shredded. Some tried to reorganize, but their men were gone, swallowed by the forest. The fog began to shift, revealing outlines of twisted trees and broken helmets. The silence that followed was not peace, but paralysis. For a few fragile moments, they believed the attack had ended. But this was only the first act, because far behind the lines, American observers were already calling in the next grid of coordinates. The storm was about to begin again, closer this time, heavier, deadlier, and this time, the fog wouldn't hide them. The pause was an illusion. Somewhere beyond the mist, hundreds of guns reloaded, their barrels red-hot from continuous fire. Crews moved like clockwork. Shells lifted, breech open, fuse checked, rammed, fired. Every motion was rehearsed, practiced into perfection. Then came the next strike. It began with a ripple. 1, 2, 10 detonations rolling together until the air itself seemed to harden. The second barrage was heavier, slower, designed not to shock but to pulverize. This was the American doctrine of counterforce saturation, the deliberate, layered destruction of any remaining structure or will to resist. The shells came in arcs that blurred into streaks of light across the fog. Each explosion folded over the last, turning the forest into a single continuous roar. German soldiers stumbled through the craters, their boots sinking in mud and ash. Some dragged the wounded, others fired aimlessly into the fog, as if trying to shoot the sound itself. The captains who still commanded tried to call for artillery support, but their signals went nowhere. Wires had been severed, radios lost in the first barrage. They were cut off from the regiment, from division, from the war itself. One captain, his name lost to history, scribbled coordinates by hand on a notepad, intending to call for counterfire when the line reconnected. He never finished. The next shell landed just beyond his trench. Every minute brought new destruction. The forest canopy was gone. The soil turned inside out. Craters merged into one another until the land itself became unrecognizable. A gray, breathing wound. And then, through that haze, another sound appeared, sharper, more rhythmic. American 105mm batteries shifted fire forward. Behind them, infantry battalions began to move. This was the second phase of the operation, infantry advance under rolling barrage. The fire crept forward at timed intervals, each wave of shells landing just ahead of the advancing troops. It was an old tactic perfected with new precision. A living wall of explosions that cleared the way through forest and trench alike. The German survivors barely registered it. They saw only flashes, heard only the roar. Then, from the smoke, figures began to emerge. Dark silhouettes, rifles slung low, helmets coated in frost, American soldiers, advancing through the fog, their faces streaked with mud, moved in silence except for the crunch of snow underfoot. They followed the barrage like shadows of the thunder itself. For them, this was the most dangerous moment, crossing through their own artillery zone, trusting the timing, trusting the math. Yet discipline held. Every step forward was measured, every halt synchronized with the rhythm of the guns. To the Germans, still alive, it felt like the fog itself was closing in. Machine guns fired sporadically. A few bursts echoed, then vanished beneath the next round of shelling. The Americans didn't respond immediately. They marked the muzzle flash, relayed coordinates, and seconds later, a single shell reduced the position to silence. It was war reduced to geometry. By now, the entire sector had collapsed. The road that once carried supplies from Schmidt to Vossenac was impassable, cratered, smoking, littered with wrecks. German medical stations were obliterated. Horses lay dead beside shattered carts, their breath still steaming in the cold. American officers reported minimal resistance. One after-action note described it simply: enemy positions destroyed by preparatory fire. Survivors scattered, encountered negligible organized defense. But the human cost beneath those sterile words was unimaginable. Among the ruins, survivors crawled from dugouts that had become graves. Some wandered aimlessly, hands over ears, unable to hear their own voices. Others lay staring upward, not from defiance, but from shock so deep it became stillness. A few tried to surrender, waving white cloths through the smoke. For many, the attempt came too late. In a battlefield defined by confusion, visibility was a matter of chance, and mercy was often lost to noise. By late morning, the shelling began to slow. The American guns fell silent one by one, replaced by the dull rattle of small arms fire and the crunch of advancing boots. When the fog began to thin, the true scale of destruction appeared. What had once been forest was now an open graveyard of splintered trunks and blackened snow. The air smelled of iron and burned wood. The thunder had passed, but its echo lingered in every crater, every broken helmet, every stunned survivor who still couldn't understand what had happened. In command posts miles behind the line, German field radios fell silent. Entire companies had disappeared from the map. Headquarters officers reported no contact with forward units, unaware that those units no longer existed. For the American commanders, it was a textbook success, a demonstration of coordination, logistics, and overwhelming firepower. For the men on the ground, it was something else, a glimpse into the industrial future of war, where destruction came not from courage or strategy, but from calculation. As the surviving German captains were captured or fled into the woods, one thought echoed in their minds: that strange, cruel irony that had begun it all. They had waited for the thunder to save them, and it had, only for the enemy. The storm had passed, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold. In numbers, in wreckage, in memory. When the guns finally fell silent, silence itself felt unnatural. It wasn't peace. It was the vacuum left behind when sound is erased. Smoke drifted over what was once the German front line. The forest had disappeared. The landscape was a field of craters, tree stumps, and twisted metal. A moonscape on Earth. American patrols moved cautiously among the wreckage. They expected ambushes, but there were few left alive to resist. A few prisoners stumbled forward with their hands raised, eyes vacant, faces gray with ash. Many were deafened, concussed, or too numb to speak. An officer from the U.S. 28th Infantry Division later wrote in his report, "We found no organized defense, only fragments of men. Most had no weapons left. The shelling had done the fighting for us. The bombardment had lasted less than an hour. Yet in that time, the artillery of the U.S. 7 Corps had fired more than 10,000 shells, coordinated from multiple divisions across miles of front. It was one of the most concentrated fire missions. Of the Western campaign, Siegtranfeinfacindro, Weisicentrotaindo Spur, pattern that would soon become standard as the Allies pushed through. German assessments after the battle described the result in one word: vernichtet, annihilated. Whole companies ceased to exist on the rolls. The officers who had gathered around their maps before dawn were either dead, missing, or captured. Field hospitals behind the line overflowed with the wounded, many suffering from trauma rather than visible injuries. Men who trembled at the sound of a truck backfiring, men who no longer spoke. This was the unseen casualty of modern artillery: psychological destruction. Historians later compared the effect to the bombardments of Verdun and the Somme in the First World War. The thunder of high explosives could tear through more than soil and steel. It tore through nerve and memory. For the Americans, The success was tactical and symbolic. Every shell fired was a statement of industrial might, the manifestation of a nation whose factories could outproduce an empire. The artillery that broke the German line that morning had been built in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Illinois, shipped across oceans, hauled by convoys of trucks through the mud of France. Behind each gun stood not just soldiers, but an entire continent's machinery: the assembly lines, the refineries, the railways. The Germans could no longer match it. Their own artillery was starving, short of shells, short of fuel, short of trained men. Even their vaunted 80mm guns were being pulled back to defend cities from bombers instead of aiding the front. This imbalance, this widening gap between American abundance and German exhaustion, defined the war's closing months. A captured German lieutenant, interviewed days later, expressed it with quiet disbelief. "We thought the thunder was ours, but they had more thunder than the sky itself." By December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge was beginning elsewhere, a desperate final offensive that would soon consume both armies in the Ardennes. But here, on this forgotten stretch of front, the outcome had already been written: the failure to hold, the collapse of communication, the total reliance on reinforcements that never came. It all spoke to a broader truth. Germany was fighting ghosts, divisions that existed only on paper, reserves that were already gone, hope that had long since turned hollow. The American advance continued cautiously, securing each shattered position before moving on. Engineers worked to clear mines and rebuild roads torn apart by shell fire. Medics moved through the wreckage, collecting the wounded from both sides. There were no celebrations, just the quiet work of survival, the grim arithmetic of counting the dead, marking the wounded, reporting the missing. As dusk fell, the sky glowed faintly orange from burning fuel and shattered trees. Somewhere, a single gun fired, not in battle, but as a signal. The day was over. The thunder that had started as salvation for one side had become a symbol of ending, not just for a company or a regiment, but for the German army itself. The line that once stood firm was gone, and what remained in that gray ruin of silence and smoke was the realization that the age of man's courage was giving way to the age of machinery. In the days that followed, the front stabilized, not because the Germans held, but because there was no one left to move forward. American engineers transformed the shattered ground into a staging area. Bulldozers flattened the craters, clearing paths for supply trucks. Graves registration units marked the fallen with temporary crosses, their names written in pencil before the rain washed them clean. What had been a battlefield was now a landscape of logistics, a place to pass through, not to remember. For the Germans, reports filtered slowly up the chain of command. The surviving liaison officers reached division headquarters days later, pale and trembling, their uniforms blackened by smoke. They spoke of a bombardment so sudden and total that no countermeasure had been possible. Their superiors listened in silence. They had heard the same stories before. In Normandy, in Aachen, in the Hürtgen forest. Each time, the pattern repeated: miscommunication, delayed reinforcements, and the crushing precision of Allied artillery. But this one struck deeper. It wasn't just defeat. It was humiliation by sound. The captains had believed what they heard. They mistook their own destruction for hope. That detail passed almost unnoticed in official records. Yet among soldiers it became a grim parable whispered at the front. Men joked bitterly that they could no longer tell the difference between thunder and death. Behind the lines, German command staff revised their tactics once again. Orders went out to improve camouflage, to reposition gun batteries, to disperse formations. None of it mattered. By late 1944, The Wehrmacht's resources were too thin, its morale too frayed, its skies too full of Allied bombers. The American side, meanwhile, studied the operation as a case study in precision coordination. Reports from the 19th Tactical Air Command and 7th Corps Artillery described near-perfect synchronization. Air observation posts, forward fire controllers, and preset firing tables had created a level of accuracy unheard of in 1918. This was no longer the chaotic, mud-choked war of trenches. It was mathematics and machinery intertwined, destruction reduced to data. Yet among the American ranks, there was little triumph. The infantry who walked through the ruins found no glory in what they saw. They had witnessed the power of their own guns and what that power did to men. One private from the 9th Infantry Division wrote home, "We didn't fight them. The shells did. We just walked through what was left." It was a new kind of war. Clean on the map, catastrophic in the flesh. As the campaign pushed eastward, through the Siegfried Line and toward the Rhine, the lessons of that day repeated again and again. Firepower became the language of victory, and silence its punctuation. The thunder that destroyed those waiting captains echoed far beyond that forest. It marked a transition from the belief in individual valor to the dominance of industrial warfare. The men who once measured courage by how long they could hold a trench now measured survival by how far they were from the next coordinate on a firing grid. In Berlin, intelligence summaries from the front arrived in fragments. They mentioned heavy losses, a collapsed battalion, positions erased by bombardment. No names, no details, just the familiar refrain. Contact lost with forward elements. By then, it no longer surprised anyone. The machinery of war had outgrown human comprehension. The American push continued. Each captured position became another logistical point on a vast, rolling offensive. Bridges rebuilt, supply routes extended, artillery redeployed. Every step forward was powered by the same rhythm: load, aim, fire, advance. For the few Germans who survived that morning's barrage, the memory remained sharper than any wound. Years later, in post-war interviews, one recalled it quietly. "We waited for help. Then we realized the help was theirs." It was a sentence that could have described the fate of the entire German army. From that moment onward, the thunder on the Western Front no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the enemy, to the factories across the Atlantic, to the numbers, to the endless supply of shells and steel. The world had changed, and beneath the broken trees of that nameless forest, it had announced its arrival with thunder. The guns are silent now. The fog has lifted, but the echo of that morning, when German captains mistook salvation for destruction, would linger long after the war itself was over. War remembers thunder, but forgets the silence that follows. In the winter of 1944, the men who mistook artillery for reinforcements were not fools. They were soldiers raised in an era when courage and command still seemed stronger than machines. But the battlefield they faced no longer belonged to that age. The thunder that consumed them was not just sound. It was the voice of a new world, a world where industrial power replaced heroism, and where precision mattered more than presence. For Germany, it marked the end of initiative. Their armies, once masters of lightning warfare, now fought beneath storms they could neither command nor predict. Their soldiers waited for strength that no longer existed, while across the lines, the Allies had transformed war into an equation of production and logistics. Artillery had become the Empire's heartbeat, calculated, timed, and infinite. And so, the story of those captains, crouched in a frozen forest, waiting for the sound of salvation, became the story of a nation mishearing history itself. They listened for the arrival of power that was already gone. They waited for thunder that would never again be theirs. In the broader sweep of the war, This moment passed quietly. One bombardment among thousands. No monuments were raised for it. No film reels captured the faces in the fog. Yet, within that single misjudgment lay the entire arc of Germany's collapse. Overconfidence meeting the unstoppable rhythm of industrial warfare. By the time the front moved east toward the Rhine, the lesson was clear. Firepower, not faith, defined survival. And the men who had once commanded, by voice now lived and died by calculation. WWII, thunder that fell upon that forest, was not merely a sound of defeat. It was the sound of transformation. The modern battlefield had spoken, and in its cold, mechanical language, it declared the old world over.